So in today's lesson, we're going to be learning about the urinary system, the human urinary system. So what I've equipped you with is a diagram, an unlabeled diagram of the human urinary system. So hopefully you have that in front of you before we begin, as we start to talk about some different anatomical features of the urinary system, and also a student version of this note. So taking a look, I just want to take a look at the central diagram here, just to give you an overview, and then we'll zoom in on certain areas. So I want to give you a quick reminder about the difference between veins and arteries. You'll remember arteries away. So away from what? Away from the heart. And veins are going to go towards the heart. So if I look at my urinary system here, I can see veins and arteries. So here I'm showing you the kidney, and the kidney are these they're about the size of your fist, and they're on your dorsal side, your back side, and you'll have one on the left and one on the right, most of you. And so then if we look at the renal vein, you should know that renal is an adjective that refers to the kidney. So if you're not aware of that, renal, anytime you see renal pelvis, renal vein, renal artery, that refers to the kidney. So renal vein, well, veins go towards the heart, which means it's going away from the kidney. Okay, my renal artery meaning away, but away from the heart, which means towards the kidney. All right, and then we look at, you'll remember when we talked about the circulatory system in grade 11, we looked at the vena cava, both superior and inferior. Inferior just means going to the lower extremities, and then the aorta. So the aorta is that large, thick blood vessel that where blood leaves the heart, and the vena cava is the large blood vessel that leads towards the heart. Okay, so each of those branch off to each of the kidneys separately. And that's our blood flow to the kidneys. And the kidneys are super vascular, lots of capillary action going on in there, but we'll get to that. So now taking a look at the kidneys, they're also connected to what are called ureters. And so the ureters are the vessel that connects your kidneys to your bladder. And so I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the role of the kidney is to filter your blood, and in so doing, they produce urine. So any filtered blood, any waste products that your body doesn't want to reabsorb into its circulatory system are going to leave the body from the kidney through the ureter to the bladder. And the bladder is basically this muscular entity. You can see here's a close-up. You'll have one ureter coming from each kidney. You can almost see a little hole there. Yeah, oh, there's the label for that. And so we know that our bladder will contract and expand to hold urine to a point. But then, what helps with that are our urinary sphincters. And so any sphincter is going to control the muscular sort of control panel, I guess, to control the amount of urine that goes out. And so we can actually practice strengthening our urinary sphincters by doing what's called a Kegel exercise, which is just and that helps us maintain bladder control. And so, urine is going to be held in the bladder until such time as you want to empty it, at which points it will go through the urinary sphincters and out the urethra. All right, so there we have those two pieces. So again, kidney to ureter, to bladder, to urethra, to the outside world. So now let's take a look at the kidney itself. So if you were to take it, actually you can go, if you go to the store and purchase a kidney, like a beef kidney or a pig kidney, and you slice it across the way that this diagram shows, then you'll actually be able to see some of these structural features. So let me break it down for you. So here's our ureter, and the ureter leads, the ureter, if you trace it back, goes towards this sort of cavity inside the middle of the kidney called the pelvis or the renal pelvis. Now, I think we should use renal pelvis to specify, but pelvis just essentially means cavity. And so that's essentially what it is, right? And so basically all of the work is being done by the kidney in these sort of zones. So we have the renal medulla and we have the renal cortex. So the renal medulla is located on the outside, and then the cortex are these sort of like, I don't even know they're sort of almost triangular sort of areas that are a little bit darkened, and that is referred to as the cortex. So, not too much to know, and of course we can look at the overall picture and then zoom into the kidney, and you can see that the renal artery going away from the heart but towards the kidney, and the renal vein going away from the heart, which means towards the kidney, and providing a blood supply to our kidney itself. Okay, so major anatomical features. We have the renal medulla, the renal cortex, these little lobes here. We have the renal pelvis, which of course all of the blood being filtered in the kidney leads to the renal pelvis and then drains out through the ureter. So let's see how much you remember about what we just spoke about. So the kidney, well, we can see the kidney. What is the job of the kidney? Its job is to filter blood. And so there will be, when we break down products like proteins and nucleic acids, then there are some nitrogenous wastes right there. And so our body needs to get rid of that. And so it does so by way of the kidney. It also helps us to balance our water levels and other mineral levels as well. The ureter, all the ureter is it leads that waste to the bladder from the kidney. Of course, the bladder is that muscular organ that stores our urine, and it has a thick muscular wall and allows for the urine allows for a bit of expansion. And then, of course, the urethra is that tube that carries our bladder to the exterior of our body. So now let's talk about the kidneys themselves. Let's see how much you remember. So if we were to take a cross-section of the kidney, we would see the cortex, the medulla, and the renal pelvis. So I want you to just go through this exercise of saying, well, if I had to explain this to, let's say, my parent, what would I say? If I drew a diagram of the kidney showing all the different parts, how would I label that? Or how would I explain to somebody who didn't know anything about the kidney what the different components were? And I'm hoping you would say, okay, well, the cortex. Cortex is a word that means sort of outer. And so the cortex is that outer connective tissue that we see in the kidney. And the medulla I think means middle. Don't quote me on that, but I always think of it as meaning middle. And so the cortex is the outer part. The medulla is the middle part where we see those lobes. Okay, so, and then of course the renal pelvis is where all of the waste that is filtered by the kidneys collects before it leads to the ureter and then eventually to the bladder and out the urethra. Okay, so it's a hollow chamber as such because it is all of your urine product is draining into it. So there we have it. Those are the three parts of the kidney. And what we're going to talk about next is, what is actually happening in the kidney itself? What functional structure within the kidney does all of that filtering for us? What does that look like? So at this point, you should also have in your notes a diagram of a structure called a nephron. So anything is also, aside from renal means kidney, nephron refers to also a structure within the kidney that does the filtering. So for example, a doctor who might be concerned with kidney function is called a nephrologist, and that's a function of the fact that they would have to know a lot about the nephron. So if you were to zoom in on the kidney, what you would see would be millions and millions of these little structures called nephrons. And so I'm going to see if I can find another diagram for you. just to give you a little bit of context about where all of this is located. Okay, so here I found this on the internet. So what this is just to kind of show you, well, where is this nephron structure coming from and where does it fit in the kidney? So if we were looking at a kidney, right, here we have, there's our renal pelvis, our renal cortex, and then the lobes of the medulla. And so if we were to just kind of, here's this little portion of the kidney we're zooming in on. So here would be the cortex. Here we can see that medulla there, that lobey kind of thing. And that what we have inside are millions of these structures called nephrons, which if we zoom in on them look like that. And so you'll notice a couple of things about the nephron. Is that, part of it is in the cortex, the renal cortex, and part of it is in the medulla. And so that's one thing I wanted you to notice. And so I'm just going to put this aside. We're going to look at the nephron and then kind of come back. And so notice, so here now in this other diagram of the nephron, which I kind of prefer, you can see several different layers. So notice that they've colored different sections of this component of the diagram, sort of lighter and darker. So this darker part up here is meant to signal the fact that we're looking at the part of the nephron that is located in the cortex of the kidney. And then this lower part, this lighter part here, that part of the nephron is located in the renal medulla, right? So the lobey kind of thing would be here, right? And so a couple of features. What I want to do is I want to sort of trace blood flow into the nephron for you. So imagine that you are blood that needed to be filtered because you have some nitrogenous waste and some other components that the body considers wasteful and doesn't need. You would be traveling into the nephron within the kidney, each one of many of these structures, by way of the renal artery. Remember, artery away from the heart toward the kidney. So it would go from the renal artery to this structure called the afferent arteriole. So afferent sort of to me means ingoing. And so it's going to go by way of the afferent arteriole. Now you'll remember that the job of the kidney, and specifically the nephron, is to filter blood. Well, if you were filtering coffee, how would you do that? Well, you would have, your little filter basket, and, you would have the water dripping in, and then, with the coffee grinds, and it would sort of filter through the bottom, right? Well, in the same way, our blood has to travel through some sort of a sieve-like structure in order to be filtered. And that structure is called the glomerulus or the glomerulus. And it is basically, so your blood, here is just a zoom in of this little section of the nephron. So your blood again has come in from your renal artery, will go into the nephron by way of the afferent arteriole. And this is where I want to zoom into this diagram here. And so here's our afferent arteriole. And you'll notice that, the glomerulus is this really high surface area capillary network. And so blood will enter into the glomerulus at very high pressure, higher than what it would be outside of the nephron. And that acts to sort of push certain materials through into the nephron, and while leaving others kind of behind, sort of like the coffee grinds. We want the coffee grinds to be left behind in our coffee filter, but we want the coffee extract to filter through, right? So some materials are going to move into the nephron, while others are just going to be too large to pass through the walls of that capillary network. And they're going to just kind of exit and return back into the bloodstream by way of the efferent arteriole. So afferent is ingoing, efferent arteriole is outgoing. Okay, so that's the glomerulus. And so any materials like nitrogenous waste, they're going to be able to move through into the nephron. And so let's just imagine that you're like a little nitrogenous waste particle of some description. And so you're going to move, and then let's say you filtered through the glomerulus in Bowman's capsule. So I should mention that the glomerulus is held in this capsule-like structure called Bowman's capsule. And Bowman's capsule is just like the collecting zone. It would be like the coffee pot underneath the coffee maker. So your nitrogenous waste is going to move into Bowman's capsule, and from there it's going to move into the structure called the proximal tubule. So proximal means, I think, close by. So proximal means near. Think like I'm approximating a value. So sometimes it's also referred to as the proximal convoluted tubule. And so convoluted just means kind of windy. So, and you can sort of see that with this structure. So nitrogenous waste moves in the nephron through the proximal tubule. And then it travels down into this kind of loop-like structure that extends into the medulla. That is called the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle, I kind of like that name. So proximal tubule to loop of Henle, and then back up what's called the distal tubule, or sometimes the distal convoluted tubule. And the distal just means distant or far away. So the distal tubule leads into something called a collecting duct. And so you can imagine that, with millions of nephrons in your kidney, you would need to have some kind of sort of common collecting duct for all of the waste that manages to make its way through the nephron, right? And so that's why you can see sort of these branching off of these collecting ducts. So there would be, here's the collecting duct. So here's the distal tubule leading to the collecting duct from this nephron, and then maybe there's another distal tubule, and so on and so forth, all leading to the same collecting duct. And where is that collecting duct going to? It's leading to the renal pelvis, where eventually it's going to go out the ureter, one of the two ureters, and then to the bladder, and then eventually out the urethra to the outside world. So there we have it. Now, a couple of other features I want to mention. You'll notice that the nephron is, you'd have millions of them, and that's basically to maximize surface area, right? And so if you maximize surface area, you're going to be able to, first of all, get as much back of some of the filtrate from the nephron back into the bloodstream. One thing we're going to learn about in tomorrow's lesson is that this glomerulus is actually not super, like the kidney operates in kind of a funny sort of a way, which is that a lot of the stuff that actually passes through into Bowman's capsule and into the nephron is actually useful, and the body needs to reabsorb it, which is why you'll notice this capillary network completely surrounding this nephron and every other nephron. And that is because that provides our body with an opportunity to maybe recapture some of the filtrate that's moved into Bowman's capsule into the nephron, to kind of reabsorb it into our bloodstream and make use of it. So part of what we will talk about soon is what is actually being reabsorbed into the bloodstream at different points along the nephron. But today we're simply going to talk about just the structural anatomy of the nephron. And that's pretty much it. So notice that a couple other things. The afferent arteriole, so we have blood going into the glomerulus and filtrate moving through. And then we have blood, anything that is not able to pass through into the glomerulus because it's too big or whatever, will move out the efferent arteriole. But notice that the efferent arteriole also leads to this capillary network here. And eventually the capillary network leads back to some sort of a venule, and then to the renal vein, and then of course back to the rest of the body. So, that is pretty much it. The capillary network is referred to as would sort of make sense, peritubular capillaries. Peri meaning, think like perimeter, surrounding. So peritubular capillaries that are surrounding these tubular structures called the nephron. And that is pretty much it. Let's write some stuff down. Okay, so you should have a table like this. Let's see if you can kind of predict what should go in each of these categories before I unveil. So as I mentioned, the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. It's what is doing the filtering of our blood. And we have over 1 million of them in each of our kidneys. And you did notice, hopefully, that each of the nephrons were surrounded by those peritubular capillaries. So it is intensely vascular. Lots of vascular tissue. All right, so the afferent arterioles, afferent meaning ingoing, and so those are small blood vessels that are leading into the nephron from our renal artery. And then so from there, so this is a bit of a pathway, right? So from there, our blood is going to travel into the glomerulus, which is what? Well, it's like a sieve. And so its job as a sieve is to filter certain materials through into the nephron while leaving others out. Right? And it has a high surface area, and that is just a function of the fact that its job is to get as much out of the blood as is possible. So efferent, I want you to think efferent, exit. And so that is where any components of the blood that are not able to be filtered into the nephron by way of the glomerulus are just going to enter the efferent arterioles. Okay, and then when they exit the efferent arterioles, any material is going to travel through the peritubular capillaries. The job of the peritubular capillaries is basically to reabsorb material as it's into the bloodstream, back into the bloodstream, even though it might have passed into the nephron. Bowman's capsule. Bowman's capsule is that little sort of spherical type structure that will capture any of the filtrate coming through Bowman's capsule. So I guess it is I didn't think of it as a funnel, but I guess, yeah, it is a bit of a funnel. And so Bowman's capsule and our proximal and distal tubules are all located in the cortex, the renal cortex. Whereas the loop of Henle is going to extend down into the renal medulla. Okay, so again, proximal, meaning I think like approximate. When you approximate, you kind of make a best guess or you come close to the right answer. So proximal, close by. That's where your filtrate's going to move after it leaves Bowman's capsule. Then it's going to travel into the loop of Henle. As I mentioned, that that loop extends into the renal medulla, and that becomes really important for certain ion movement, mostly sodium. The distal tubule, I think distant tubule, so it's at the other end of the loop of Henle and leads to the collecting ducts, which essentially the collecting ducts are the way for the filtrate that does eventually make its way all the way through the nephron to lead into the renal pelvis and essentially becomes urine. So there we have it. That is the breakdown of our urinary system and all of the structural components. I think really mostly what is probably new to you is the last little bit on the nephron. So it may be useful for you to have some sort of like a Quizlet made to help remind you of these structures, or even just regular cue cards. There's a video that I'm going to post too along with this that will summarize. Actually, maybe we'll do that tomorrow as a warm-up activity. And as always, reach out with any questions that you might have. I'm happy to help.